So I decided to carefully compare the image quality of the Nikon Z8 and the D850. To do this comparison, I captured a series of photos on all cameras using the base ISO of 64, going all the way to the maximum ISO settings to determine if one camera has an advantage over the other when it comes to dynamic range and also noise levels. When I imported the images to Lightroom, I used the 1:1 import setting. This way I'm able to view these images at full resolution. I spent the last days comparing the cameras in great detail, but no matter how I spin things, I keep finding that the raw files of both cameras are quite similar no matter which ISO setting I compare. These cameras are certainly not identical and have different sensors, but the results are so similar. Let me show you what I'm talking about. For this comparison, I used the same 35mm lens on both cameras. I kept my aperture at f6.3 to make sure that none of the images had any significant vignetting to prevent any sort of shadows around the image. And I made sure that none of these pictures required a shutter speed of 1 second or slower to prevent long shutter noise. Here we can see all the raw photos of the D850 and the Z8, and up here we can choose the particular ISO that we would like to compare. Now here I got the D850's raw, on the right I got the Z8, and now I'm going to use the compare tool to take a closer look at both images. When zooming in, we can clearly see that both images are very clean. I did try my absolute best to keep the focus very exact on both cameras as I swapped the lens, but once again keep in mind that the Z8 did need an adapter to mount the lens that I used on the D850. So there was a slightly different distance from the camera to the subject. Now once again, we check out this particular corner, and perhaps the focus was very slightly different, but we can see the image is very clear, of course, at ISO 64. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to very drastically challenge these raw files and increase the exposure by 4 on both raw files, and then I'm going to go back to the compare tool. And once we zoom in, let's take a look at how these raw files each retain the details. Particularly in the highlights, we can see here things are fading, but the results are very similar. Let's take a look at the font down here on the left. We can see the results are once again very, very similar. I can't choose one camera over the other when it comes to dynamic range when we're looking at base ISO 64. And we can see some of the detail was fading away here, but it's very similar. I could play around with the exposure, but once again, these results to me are very similar and I can't pick one winner over the other. Let's step it up a little bit and choose an ISO a little bit above the base ISO. Let's go to, let's say, ISO 250. Once again, we got the D850 on the left, the Z8 on the right. I'm going to use the compare tool and let's zoom in here and let's take a look at noise. The focus might have been very slightly off, but when it comes to noise, we can see that once again, it's very similar. I'm going to do the same thing and very drastically increase the exposure on both of these raw files. And let's zoom in here and check out what is happening. Let's take a look at this upper right corner here. Keep in mind that these are 1:1 previews, so loading them in Lightroom might take a moment. We can see there's noise up here in the dark areas. We did bring up the exposure by 5, or actually by 4 on both of these images, but the noise looks very similar. Now, in most cases, I would not need to crank up my exposure by 4, but in this case, we are challenging these raw files to see which results we are left with. And once again, here we can also see that the noise is very similar. Looking at some of the faded regions, we can see that a similar level of detail is retained. Let me go ahead and push the exposure up by 5 to go very extreme, and the results are once again very similar. I cannot pick one winner over the other. We can see most of the detail here is gone, very little is retained, and it's very, very similar. I would not feel comfortable to choose one winner over the other. Now let's jump up to ISO 800 and take a look how the noise might increase on both of these RAW files and how the dynamic range holds up. Let me zoom here into the center. It might take a moment to load as these are massive preview files. So the right side already loaded, and here I got the left side. Once again, the left is the D850 and on the right I got the Z8. I find that the noise is once again very similar and I can't choose one winner over the other. Going down here, and I think it's safe to say that the focus was very slightly off. But looking at the noise, I think it's very, very similar, and I once again cannot pick one image over the other. Let's go ahead and very drastically increase our exposure once again and zoom in and take a look at what happens. We could actually stay right here. We can see that most of this detail is blown out, and it's a little bit of detail that is left over. It's very similar. The noise looks very similar, and I'm very confident to say that both of these RAW files at ISO 800, they are very similar. And also checking out this item over here, we can once again see the noise is very similar and the detail that is retained is also similar, and I can't choose one image over the other at ISO 800. Let's take a look at ISO 1600, 3200 and 6400, and perhaps an even higher ISO as well, but the results will once again be very similar. When we simply look, let me go back here, the compare tool. When we look simply at noise levels, we can find that the noise is very similar. Both cameras perform pretty well, but whichever noise that they both introduce at this ISO, it's very similar. So I'm going to go ahead and also push the exposure by quite a bit on both of these. And let's take a look at how much detail is preserved and how much detail we lose. Perhaps I should bump up the exposure even a bit further, but we can see what is retained and what is lost is very similar. I'm going to push up the exposure by 5. And let's take a look once again. And here we can see again, it's very similar. You could be very nitpicky, but I think it's safe to say that the results are very similar. And keep in mind that this comparison was not conducted in a lab. There might be perhaps very, very tiny differences in exposure as I did this comparison, as I was taking these shots, but we can see that the results are very similar. I'm going to go to ISO 3200. I'm going to compare the noise of both of these, and we can once again see very similar noise levels. Looking here in the dark shadow areas, looking down here, the noise is very similar, and once again I'm going to push the exposure quite far, +5. We are at ISO 3200 once again. Let's go to the font. This is, I think, a good gradient, a good spot to tell if there are any significant differences, and I think it's very, very similar. You could perhaps make the argument that there's a little bit more retained on the Z8, but again, because these photos were not shot in a lab, perhaps there are slight exposure differences, so I am hesitant to draw the conclusion that the Z8 performs better at ISO 3200, but if it does, and if this is an improvement over the D850, it is very, very little. And let's take a look at ISO 6400. I personally rarely use an ISO over 6400. Even if I were to go up to 6400, that's pretty rare, but I do feel more comfortable getting up to 6400 versus anything above that. So I was very curious to see how both of these raw images hold up at 6400, and I think the noise is very similar. Now let's look at how much. Let me go back here. Before I increase the exposure, let's take a look at some more noise actually in the image, and I think it's very similar once again. If I were to go ahead and very drastically bump up the exposure, let's see if the Nikon Z8 has a more significant advantage, and perhaps we could argue that the Z8 performs slightly better at ISO 6400 when retaining dynamic range. Again, these are very extreme comparisons that I'm doing here. I would normally not even have to push up my exposure by this amount, but we can see that there's a lot of noise in both images, very similar amounts of noise, and whatever detail is retained, it's quite similar. You could perhaps see a 2% improvement on the Z8, but I personally, once again, don't feel confident enough to claim that one is better than the other. Last but not least, let's take a look at the more extreme ISO settings. Let's take a look at the 25,000 one. Let's compare the noise in both of these images. I think once again, it's very similar, and personally, I would never even find a need to use such a high ISO setting. Very similar noise levels, and let's go ahead and crank up the exposure. When bringing up the exposure by 5, we pretty much have identical results. Let's take a look at the font, and I think it's very safe to say the results are very similar. And there you have it. That was my quick comparison of the Z8 and the D850. If you have done your own comparison, I'd be curious to hear what your conclusion is. The bottom line is both cameras have exceptional RAW photo capabilities, and I don't think one beats the other when it comes to still image quality.